Well, welcome everyone to the first in our new webinar series for the National Science Policy Network's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The webinar series is going to start off with, I should have the right slides first. Making science accessible for all. The focus this session will be on language access. And we do have two interpreters today for increased access and communication. So I just want to give a shout out to Cristiano Garcia and Paulo Morales del Castillo. So we also have auto transcriptions through Zoom. So please feel free to access that if you need or want to use that. And then the last little thing for logistical purposes that I will say is you can send your question in at any point in time using our Q&A function. You can also submit them anonymously if you don't want your name attached, or upvote questions that others might have asked in the Q&A box as well. So we would love to have audience participation and questions. So submit them as soon as you have a thought, and that way it will be in the queue. All right. I didn't give an introduction, but I will do so now. I will be moderating the session. My name is Annabelle Lalinko, she, her. I am a PhD candidate at Iowa State University studying chemical education in the ways that students make connections with context about chemistry and sustainability. Outside of my research and why I'm here today, I am the immediate past chair for the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee of the National Science Policy Network. And I'm so glad to be here today. I know one of our key organizers, Marcy Cockrell, and the current chair, Thomas Burnett, weren't able to be here today. So I'm here to guide you through this process. So what to expect? We are going to kick off a little bit with an intro on how we came up with this webinar series, what the focus was on for today, and then I will introduce our speakers and they'll have a few minutes each to talk about themselves and their work related to language access. And then we'll go into our moderated Q&A and audience questions. So again, this is really your time to submit any questions that you may have as it comes up. So the planning of this webinar really started from a policy position paper that came out of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And one of our panelists today, Dr. Anya Virk, is a co-author on a call to diversify the lingua franca of academic STEM communities. It was the second place winner of a special issue within the Journal of Science Policy and Governance entitled Shaping the Future of Science Policy last August. So we're thrilled to have Rania here with us today, and I'll introduce her along with our other panelists in a minute. This policy positions paper sort of sets the frame for our discussion today about expanding the languages used in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to create a more diverse, equitable, and accessible scientific enterprise. As you can see from the quote on the slide, we have witnessed as a society what happens when the ugly tradition of cultural neglect comes to a head. White supremacy, racism, and prejudice range from blatant violence to prolonged deleterious effects of gatekeeping and exclusion in the workplace. In academia, other diversity and cultural issues have been intentionally addressed, but global linguistic diversity desperately needs to be monitored. It's a snippet from the policy position paper. We have linked it in the chat as well if you haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, and if you need a refresher. So the article's authors note the scientific advances are hindered when research and publications done in languages other than English aren't cited or considered as credible, or when cultural competencies aren't included in the research and policy solutions. Excellent examples of this include English language climate change research, which largely excludes the perspectives of research in South America, and COVID-19 research, which largely ignores critical research published in Chinese. And so we're here today with some amazing panelists, not only the author of this paper, but other folks who have done great work into diversifying the access of science through language. And so I'll go ahead and start off from introducing folks from the graphic left to right, and I'll give each folks a few minutes to talk about, provide some opening remarks, and then we'll move into some moderated and audience questions. So let me make sure I have everything all set up. Rania Verk was a PhD candidate, or during her PhD, she was at Northwestern and was part of the Science Policy Outreach Task Force, the Northwestern chapter of the National Science Policy Network, when she published and co-authored the paper that we are talking about today, but she is currently now a postdoctoral scholar investigating mechanisms that contribute to chemo invasion in the Steve Altschuler and Lonnie Wu's group at the University of California, San Francisco. And in her time at Northwestern as a biomedical engineering PhD, she was involved in her department's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, where she organized events and initiatives to raise awareness about DEI-related issues experienced within the department and biomedical research. So, Rania, if you'll have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Annabelle, for such a lovely introduction. So yeah, my name is Rania Verk. I recently got my PhD from Northwestern University, where I was able to have some pretty cool opportunities to be involved in DEI-related initiatives. One really cool opportunity was this policy paper that Annabelle just introduced. The rationale basically for this policy paper is that we were trying to think, in general in STEM, especially academia, a certain professionalism is associated with someone who is white, male, and also fluent in English. And I personally have a lot of colleagues, like family and friends. My mom is from Greece, my dad is from India. So I think, coming here and not really being able to publish maybe completely fluent science communication in English when people first get here and English isn't their native language actually becomes a very kind of huge obstacle, and they have to spend extra time and effort in order to be able to communicate in this very high caliber academic way and publish in these high profile journals. So we were trying to think, first of all, it's not necessarily right and it's very inaccessible to have academic science predominantly published in English. I think 80% of Elsevier Scopus papers are published in English, even though, a very, very decently sized population throughout the world speaks many different languages. So that is kind of inherently unfair. And then in the United States, I think the government especially needs to increase efforts to be able to improve, first of all, translation services. And I think too, it would be very important to increase the predominance of multilingual publishing within journals, high caliber journals especially. And something that was really cool that JSPG did for us is that we were able to translate our paper into 5 different languages. And these were translated by family and friends who felt pretty strongly about this issue. And JSPG was able to host this multilingual publication on their site. So we think that increasing accessibility, breaking down barriers, really changing the definition of what exactly is like professional in STEM is very important for us to increase overall language accessibility. And thank you for inviting me to be a panelist. I'm very excited to be here.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm also moving around the pins, so you'll, or the spotlights. So you'll have to give me just a second. Oop. The next person that I would like to introduce is Dr. Becca Tarvin. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her lab studies evolutionary mechanisms underlying adaptation and diversification with a focus on animals that acquire chemical defenses from their environment. Dr. Tarvin is interested in making science more accessible by breaking down language barriers, in part because she has been privileged to work alongside many scientists from South America who have faced language-related economic and social barriers during their STEM training. She and her lab believe that translating science into more languages will have a positive impact on science by diversifying STEM professionals and the audience who can access STEM content. If you want to know her education and lineage, we did link the speaker bios down below in the chat as well. But I want to make sure we have time and space for Dr. Tarvin.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and thank you again for the invitation to be here. Language is something that's really important to me. So as Annabelle explained, partly why I'm interested in language is because I maintain an international research program. And so I've been working in South America for more than a decade. And as someone who grew up speaking English, English has not really been a barrier for me. But I can see through the experiences of my collaborators and my graduate students and students here at the university as well that language is something that's very personal that can have really big impacts on your career. And so I think as someone coming from a place of privilege at an institution like UC Berkeley, we have a responsibility to make efforts and make spaces and opportunities for people and to change how we do or what we assume is the right way to do things. So I guess recently I've published 2 papers. I've been a part of 2 different working groups in my department. One is about translation specifically and how machine tools have facilitated the way to do translation of scientific literature. And the other is about increasing equity in the way we do field biology. So working in parks and outside, often you're also working with people from those areas. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how we collaborate, especially in international spaces. And of course, language is important there as well. So I'd be happy to talk about any of those things. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And last but not least, I have the honor of introducing Gabrielle Arellano, who is a heritage signer. As I get into the spotlight, there is a heritage signer with the ancestry of Mayan and Olmec, who lives and is employed in the United States, Denmark, Italy, and the UK. And as you may have guessed it, knows all 5 of those sign languages. Gabrielle has also studied sign language linguistics and anthropology, American Sign Language and Deaf Studies, and language documentation on Yucatec Sign Language or Indigenous Sign across his education. He was involved in a committee advisory with the Smithsonian Science Education Center via the Smithsonian Institute, was a deaf STEM camp director for Camp Mark in upstate New York, has led deaf STEM programs with outreach centers via the Texas School for Deaf Austin. Currently, he is now the CEO of STEMS, STEMS, which is a social enterprise offered as an educational program. So science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and sign language, and is committed to closing the exposure gap for underrepresented populations in the sign language community of learners. So with that being said, I will leave it to Gabriel to introduce more about himself and his work.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really grateful to be part of this panel today. It's really such an interesting and relevant topic. It's timely. So a little bit more about myself. I studied in graduate school at Gallaudet University, and I wanted to see more of the language that I grew up with, lengua de señas mexicanas. My parents spoke sign language from Mexico, and so I wanted to see sign language, LSM, at Gallaudet University. So throughout the years, I've kind of worked towards bringing LSM at Gallaudet, and currently they're offering a course in LSM. So it's been quite a journey. I lived in DC near Capitol Heights or Capitol Hill. And obviously the STEM workshops were always offered, always available, because it was a high income area with resources that were readily available for all the students that lived in the area. So that inspired me to focus on my social enterprise so that people with different economic statuses or lower economic statuses can participate in STEM workshops and any type of STEMs related activities, programming, curriculum that was geared to towards children. So it's been a journey, and I have partnered with the Smithsonian Institute to make this kind of broad change. The sign for STEMs is signed in this way. And that's actually a sign that's borrowed from Europe. The sign of my company, STEMs, is signed this way. And just wanted to make that distinction in terms of language and what's available in terms of language as it relates to sign language, science language as in terminology. Now, looking more closely at learners that use sign language as a mode of communication and learning, there is a gap. There is a gap, and that gap for me is a great concern in all of my efforts with my social enterprise is to close that gap through policy change so that sign language is the mode of communication that bridges access to STEM's education.
All right, thank you so much. So what I'm going to do now is I'll stop sharing, I'll spotlight the speakers, and we'll go ahead and start with our moderated questions. And so I'll go ahead and repeat myself. And as Jasmine is on time and asking about questions, if you have any, please feel free to either put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that it's queued up for when we are getting our speakers all ready for questions. Okay, so this is one for everyone in the room. How can one deal with translations in the context of scientific terminology? So what happens when there isn't a direct translation for science things in other languages, and how does that affect sort of the translation of the science? And since it's for everyone, I'll go ahead and direct this first to reverse order, and we'll go with Gabriel first.
Can you repeat the question, Annabelle?
Yeah, absolutely. How can one deal with translations in the context of scientific terminology?
I think there are a lot of different ways and strategies to experience translated works and terminology. So if you have direct communication with the person, for example, deaf children with deaf adults, they have direct access to the communication and they'll strategize to come some understanding. And if the person is not deaf, this speaks to more of their non-fluency in terms of translating scientific language or technical language. And so those strategies that are available to fluent signers are diminished. Now, sign language interpreters are a medium to which that gets you closer to understanding the terminology in terms of science related fields. However, if they're not fluent themselves, it also complicates the access to this information. And so what is the mode of communication? Is it direct? And if it's not direct and it's going through an interpreter, then there are different sets of challenges. Also, sign language interpreters are not necessarily specialized in STEM related fields. And so that's another barrier and another challenge to overcome. In terms of IDEA, there are policies that support disabled students. However, when you look at the needs of deaf and hard of hearing, they're very specific. They're because we're also a linguistic minority. So we're in this special category that doesn't really, that idea doesn't really support learning in the general sense that IDEA supports learning for disabled students that have access to a majority language. And so having these rich signing spaces where the communication is directly in ASL with no interpreter or a person that's not fluent really supports learning. Now, there's been a slow change and progression towards having these types of discussions. But again, it's we're still very limited because we're also represented doubly as a linguistic minority and disabled person. In terms of Texas, where I'm at now, the education is completely different than the education systems that I'm familiar with in Maryland and DC, the DMV area in Virginia. The expectations are different, the standards are different, how you approach language is different. There's also signed exact English, which is a communication system that is not American Sign Language. Then with this signed exact English communication system, you're not getting to the level of critical thought that children need to be able to think about abstract concepts. And so these, there's no collaboration between the states. There's no standards among the states in terms of how to teach children a specific curriculum on STEM related fields, especially when the standards vary greatly between the states. So overall, I haven't lost hope. I think we have different communities working together to address these issues around language access and the opportunities that we have with communication when we're thinking about these signing communities and STEM education in the deaf world.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Thanks, Annabelle. Gabrielle has some very interesting perspectives here. I haven't had the pleasure of working with for hard of hearing folks, and so it's very interesting for me. I guess I'd like to answer this question mostly in the context of translating scientific literature. So I teach a course out of this working group on translation and language and science. We thought it would be interesting to have a course where students, undergraduate students, translate scientific papers into other languages. And so the course is geared primarily for students who are multilingual. We have a couple classes where we talk about translation as a field of science, and this was very interesting for me to learn about as well, because you can think about translation in so many ways. One of which is, communicating to a non-scientific audience. That's a type of translation. In the literature, translating poetry is very different from translating scientific literature. And in a way, translating scientific literature is actually easier because it's more literal. And however, and this is what gets at exactly the question Annabelle asked, which is there are specific words for which translations don't exist. And this is especially in the case in rapidly evolving sciences. In genomics, for example, there are plenty of terms that, were new as of last year. Like, of course, there are not other words in other languages. And so that's something as scientists, multilingual scientists and multilingual collaborations, we have to do. And so this is something we've thought about, kind of creating dictionaries almost, but it's something that's harder to figure out exactly what the guidelines should be or who should be doing that work. I think a good place to start is when you're translating scientific articles into other languages, maybe you put a list or you start making your own terminology list for your subfield. And so I think the more we're talking about this and the more people are aware of it, there will just be more kind of foot soldiers to do some of that work, which is going to require sustained effort for basically forever. It's a problem that's not going to go away.
Yes. And Rania.
I think that both Gabriel and Rebecca made some very interesting points. Just to kind of add on to what Rebecca was saying, I think that, we all have used Google Translate in order to be able to communicate with maybe our colleagues or, when we're traveling in other languages. And there are these like very specific words, like these like lexicons that, and for example, one of my family friends who's Greek actually translated this article to Greek, and he used for the majority, like he said, Google Translate is fine, but then there's a minority of words that require a lot of kind of thought to be able to interpret the meaning and the connotations in the different languages. And I think that that's why it's so complicated to translate these like very, very field specific academic articles, because you would probably need somebody that is in that field that also has that language proficiency in order to be able to directly translate it. And I think, like Rebecca was also talking about, we need some sort of like maybe even for each field, like some sort of working group or like roundtable where people from different languages and different communities are able to come together and be able to define maybe the most important terminology to the field, so that these translations are more easy and more accessible, because then, maybe you're making up some sort of word in another language and then you have to define what that means in the article for people to be able to understand what's happening. And then that's kind of another language barrier and might increase overall kind of confusion. So I think that that would be a really important consideration to have in the future. I think that, with that too, there could be potential issues if other, there's a lot of like dialects, for example, like the Spanish language has so many dialects, and we want to make sure that we're being inclusive of a lot of different cultures. I think there was this historian of science like Michael Gordon that said if we're doing science in 6,000 different languages, then we're going to lose a lot of information. So I think that there's definitely, you know, trade-offs between increasing inclusion among different communities and then also kind of increasing overall confusion when we're trying to publish in so many different languages. But I think that representation for these types of scenarios is also really prudent, and we need to both include, you know, linguistic diversity, geographic diversity, ethnic diversity. There's so many things to think about in order to be inclusive to everyone.
Yes, and I had a note that Rebecca, you'd love to respond or comment and add.
Yeah, I just want to add something quickly, which is actually a good place to centralize some of this terminology is Wikipedia. So I know some people already use it in this way, so you might like look at a specific topic and then switch what language you're viewing it in. And often the articles are completely different, but they'll have the terms, and so that could be one place that we work towards.
Awesome, thank you. And speaking of translating and getting this going, when you were planning the paper with your co-authors, Rania, could you maybe explain some of the proposals that you had, particularly for federal government to enact infrastructure for translation of non-English publications?
Sure. So I think that, and this is, you know, a proposal for or from people that maybe don't have too much experience in policy. So this is what we thought would maybe increase the most language accessibility. So I think that there's two problems. First of all, there are native English speakers who are only publishing in English and only citing people from English publications. So we wanted to increase the overall accessibility of these publications. So to ask federal funding agencies like NSF, NIH to maybe have a translation subsidy that they put specifically into grants that are to be used for translations, and for people to, or for journals to host the original publication in English, but also have an option for hosting multilingual publications like JSPG was able to do for us. And I think a big part of that is decreasing the cost for translations. Like right now, translating from English to another language, like a 3,000 to 10,000 word document might cost up to $10,000, which is a lot of money. And PIs who, you know, are trying to fund postdocs, PhD students, get supplies, you know, go to their own conferences, I think that's not really a feasible ask for them, especially from, you know, smaller universities who don't have as much funding. So I think that maybe working with the translation industry to help drive down costs might help to improve that. I think that in order to also, translate, increase translation to English from other languages. So if we have international scholars that are in the United States, maybe they would prefer to, you know, publish in their heritage language as well as English. And it would be very useful for them to have a translator to help them translate to English and improve maybe the overall kind of flow and fluency of the document. And those translation services, I think, are a bit less than the $10,000. Maybe it's about like $1,200 from Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese. But I think for people to be able to afford this, that's still, you know, a lot of money, especially if their advisor or superior isn't able to fund this translation cost. Then they have to really spend the extra time to be able to increase the overall kind of fluency and improve the, you know, native English of that specific journal article. So we think that it would be, you know, more helpful if the government was able to be involved and kind of help to improve the infrastructure for this.
Thank you. Yeah,
Agreed.
and I guess,
This is Gabriel,
yes.
This is Gabriel speaking. In the United States, there are a couple agencies that do focus on translating these terms into sign language. And sometimes there's a difference in cost. Sometimes there's a difference in the signs that are related. Sometimes they're the same. Some are shared, some are not shared. Things are all across the board. Some are used in schools and some are not. Like I said, again, these are kind of spread. We're at a growth phase. We're at a beginning phase at this point. Looking to Britain, they do have a show on BBC that is hosted by deaf people. It is a science-focused show that deaf people can watch and learn. And that's the best way to learn, is by video immersion, I'll call it, than by trying to learn word by word, at least for the deaf culture. In deaf culture is a collectivist culture, meaning that the community comes together to share information, to share resources. And an idea that I've had is using senior citizens to work with the youth, because senior citizens are also heritage users. They've used American Sign Language their whole lives, and they need to come together to cross-share and develop these new signs. That hasn't happened so far, but that is something that I would like to see fruition. Also, I'd like to point out another challenge when it comes to creating signs for STEM terms is the fact that different countries use different sign languages. For example, I'll give you a quick example. The sign I just did with my hands right now, in the United States, that means engineer. In Mexico or in Europe, they have a different sign for engineer. Have you seen that movement I made, right? And so this is an animation of a draft, right? A gesture of a draft, which I seem to like a little better than the American sign for engineer, which is two Y's coming together. Either way, we've got to respect the signs from each language. We can't force other sign languages to use the single stem sign language that is that sign that is generated here in the United States, because it would be akin to forcing other spoken languages to change their languages as well to use the English word that was developed for that idea or for that representation. So we can't do that. We need to respect the signs that are created with each culture, within each sign language, and each one respectively will develop in fruition to its own sign for that. But I agree, one of the biggest issues is funding. And I think it is critical for government to be involved in supporting that infrastructure somehow.
And we'll get to hear your thoughts on that in a little bit. I wanted to ask Rebecca as well, from the academic research side and talking about how you might share a little bit about what you're doing in your lab to increase cultural competency and language access a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned when I introduced myself, I run an international research program. So specifically, we study the evolution of animals that acquire toxins from their food. And much of what we work with is frogs that live in Ecuador and Colombia. And I've been working there for more than a decade, and I have long-standing collaborations with institutions and scientists from both of those countries. And so we conduct a lot of our research bilingually. Two of my graduate students are from South America and do research in their home countries. And so cultural competence we view as something that's required to do equitable science. And part of that is the language. But for example, it's not just the language. If you're going to a new region, it's a great idea to read up on the history, the social, economic, and political history of that location. That can be really important because it gives you a sense of how your actions may be interpreted and how you may also interpret the way that people speak or the customs of the region. And these are just common courtesies that take a little bit of extra time, but I think is really important to do. And so we, in one of our recent papers, this paper we wrote on translation and science, we wrote that if you work in a place like I do, if you work in a place where the primary language is not English, you have a responsibility to produce your science, both for other scientists, but also for the public in that language of that country. And that can get quite complex. In a place like Indonesia, you have thousands of cultures. Even in Ecuador and Colombia, there's dozens of languages. And so, of course, this can spiral out of control. But, translating into one language is really not a lot to ask. It should be something that we expect. And you're probably working in a team that already has language skills. So, I think the question is, how do you pay people for their time, which is what Rania was just talking about. And so the way we've been doing that is a matter of exchange in favors, but that's not quite equitable either. And so now what I've been doing is in my grant applications requesting funds for honoraria. And so we cannot necessarily afford yet to pay the sort of fees you might pay someone for a professional translation, but we can certainly give them an honorarium for their time. And the other thing I would note that and I would suggest people in general start doing is if you produce a translation, you should have a translation byline on that document where it says who translated it and then what process they used to do it, because that's also very important. So thinking about the translator, if you're using a machine translator to write what you used, and if you corrected it to say like this was manually edited after the translation, or in cases where you may not possess the ability, the language skills, you could simply write that it was machine translated and not corrected. But either way, that information can be very important, and it also gives credit to the person who did the work. And then we can start thinking about, should they be credited on Publons or these kind of places where you can get DOI or professional recognition. I think that's kind of we don't know yet what that's going to look like, but these conversations hopefully can lead to some new ideas.
Yes, thank you. And on that note about collaboration, and this is my last moderator question because I see the questions from the audience, so I want to get to them. Gabriel, since you have experience in working with multiple sign languages and effectively multiple languages, what is that process like with coordinating with people from different regions and speaking effectively different languages?
Thank you for that question. It's a really important question. We're working without funding. It's all volunteer work. We're using video cameras, different types of technologies. People are really passionate about STEM. And so it's passion that drives us to accomplish smaller goals that lead to bigger ones. In Mexico, for example, there's a wide gap. It's staggering when you think about the gap of STEM education for deaf children. And so what can we do in that situation? We start there. But the obvious answer, as always, is having direct communication to the material in sign language. And so that has been an effective way to have STEM reach deaf students through LSM. The Cardiff Science Festival, for example, was all in spoken English. And so when I participated, it was a matter of connecting deaf scientists to the organizers so that they can come together and have that exposure, have that initial conversation to then bring it more into the mainstream. So this exposure works in two ways for the organizers and the public. It was a successful event. However, funding would actually accelerate these ideas we have about creating multilingual spaces and collaborations internationally. In terms of storage and digital storage and filming, it's cost prohibitive at times especially for starting with no funding. However, Purdue University, they have a data mine program that allows you to store and save media. And so collaborations with Purdue have been very productive. And I look to further collaborations through my social enterprise STEM. I'm also a big proponent of Indigenous knowledge and traditions, heritage traditions. The Mayan people, for example, as we know, we have pyramids that still stand in existence today. And all of that was achieved through math and science. These structures are still there, and you have actual evidence, living structures that you can take advantage of to make those connections for the people that live in the area. Turtle Island Hand Talk is an organization of deaf indigenous deaf members that have partnered up with STEMs to take advantage of in heritage indigenous knowledges and methodologies to make those connections between science and the people that are from the area and that can benefit from learning from their environment as it relates to science and technology, engineering, math, via a direct route of direct communication in LSM or ASL or any sign language that's in the geographic area that you're working in.
Thank you. I think all of you have circled around this, but a question from Lizette in our audience today was asking a little bit on speaking about how language access is a social justice issue. There is a need for inclusive science communication, particularly given what we have experienced during the pandemic, and sort of your thoughts related and around that. And I want to go ahead and give Rebecca the first dibs on the question, and then we can move.
Thanks, Annabelle, and thanks, Lisette, for such a good question. Yeah, I think when I think about social justice, I mean, there's lots of reasons why language is a barrier in science, both to careers and access to scientific content. But one thing I could maybe point out from the perspective of working internationally and sometimes in areas where Indigenous peoples live is that the way that people have historically conducted science, what people now call parachute science or helicopter science, is for people who aren't from a region to come in, extract some sort of information or resource, and then study it in a different location without the involvement of local peoples. So this sort of behavior is worsened when nothing is communicated. And so language has both this, creates an opportunity, but also an obstacle in the way that the science is viewed by society. And so I've heard, this perspective that so much science is in English that if you don't speak English or you're not from an English speaking country, that somehow science is not yours or generated by your society, and it creates this kind of vague but tangible disconnect. And so in a way, actually, language, I think maybe we can view multilingualism in science as potentially an option, an opportunity to reconnect, to solve that sort of issue, which you can see very clearly through the communication about the pandemic or science investment in science, etc.
Thank you. Rania, any thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, kind of latching on to Rebecca's point. I think that, yeah, two things related to citations. I think that kind of like Rebecca was saying, this can also go the other way, not just with like the research itself, but with citations. One of the things that we found while doing our research was that there is the 2015 winner of the Nobel Prize, Tu Youyou from China, actually discovered a malaria treatment, and she was only cited once for her actually kind of, seminal article on this treatment that was based off of the wormwood that she kind of found and discovered its properties, medicinal properties. And then someone wrote an English kind of summary of her article and that got 800 citations. So I think, we really giving credit to where credit is due is a really important thing. And then another thing that I wanted to bring up, I think, and this, issue is complicated with politics as well as with language barriers. But we saw in the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of research coming out of China that people in the States didn't read at all. And this was like very basic scientific research, like on the COVID virus itself. So I think that not really having, communication between major areas of research, and even with the ecology that Rebecca was talking about, like if we're not getting especially native and indigenous knowledge that's really very well centralized in these areas, then I think that we're not able to conduct the best science that we are able to do. And I also think speaking of like dialects in the US, one of the reasons which kind of prompted us to write this article is again, kind of thinking about professionalism in STEM. African-American vernacular English is really not considered to be something that you can publish in a scientific journal. Like no one's publishing Nature articles in this specific dialect. And we kind of wanted to maybe help people like redefine what exactly is professionalism in STEM and what can be included in that definition.
Yes, and Gabriel?
I missed was it?
Oh, we were just commenting on the social justice question provided by Lisette.
Okay, thank you. That was for the interpreter. Social justice also relates to policy. Arizona State, the University of Arizona has its own policy in terms of, created a summit to create policy where they talk about social justice and science. It was really a enlightening experience because they included not just science, but expanded it to include arts, the arts, indigenous people's contributions to science. And so conferences that focus around STEM, however, aren't this inclusive. They're not thinking about social justice. And oftentimes it's a competitive type of environment where you're very protective of your own research. And so there are some barriers still, even amongst professionals. But I think that convening and having a social justice perspective can expand the reach and actually put it to action in terms of who can have access and what knowledge is being produced.
Okay. And a question came in from Natalie about can a comparison be made between scientific translation and scientific illustration? Scientific translation and data visualization seems to be well recognized in the mainstream as a career field with its own training pathways. And I'm wondering if translation could fill a similar niche. Looking at the clock, I want to make sure we also have some time for your final thoughts. So if there is one outstanding thought here. I'll go ahead and let that speaker speak. Yes, Gabriel.
One of my former bosses at Georgetown University had an issue with Star Trek Next Generation, because there was a character by the name of Data that met a deaf person in the future. There were a type of peace making entity. Data was able to use a computer and was able to learn sign language through the computer, through the illustrations. The illustrations, however, were two-dimensional. And that doesn't necessarily capture the depictions that are natural to the language and the linguistics of the language. And so these flattened illustrations, however, were the source of Data's language acquisition. So for me, those are limitations that visualizations that are captured in 2D don't bridge in terms of how you acquire language and how you transmit language.
Thank you. I am looking at our clock and I want to make sure we have time and space for our final thoughts from our speakers. So I'll go ahead and ask in our original order what your final thoughts are, and maybe if you would have some advice for folks who were interested in moving forward into a more multilinguistic world in STEM, and what they could do in their laboratories and their communities, and I think we'll wrap up there. So let's start with Rania.
So yeah, again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and it's been nice to get different perspectives from the different panelists as well. I think like one thing that's really important, and also, you know, coming from a place of privilege where I'm a native English speaker, I like listening to my colleagues and friends who aren't native speakers and kind of coming here and what are their experiences, like what are their biggest barriers, and what like maybe from their perspective could be done to kind of help improve their lives and their quality of life and their ability to communicate science. So I think that we shouldn't necessarily kind of, you know, for all of these social justice issues, assume that we know the best way forward. I think collecting information and being very, you know, intentional about what we do is very important.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll second what Rania said, which is one easy thing that everyone can do is to listen and have empathy. There are also a lot of, at this point, a lot of different papers with suggestions of things that you can do. I'll just mention a few. One is to, you know, as an individual, you certainly have within your power, no matter where you're from or what your job title is, to make space for conversations like this, and to try to make change at whatever effort that you can. And so I encourage everyone to feel like they can do something. Everything counts. And so if you're a scientist like me, I think those sorts of things include translating your scientific research. Presumably, if you're working in a multilingual team, you have some skills on your team to correct machine translation of your literature, and I think it is worth your time. It's also an act of goodwill, so I think it's very important to do that. If you are involved in publishing, if you're an editor at a journal, check to see who's on your editorial board. Are there people who speak multiple languages or not? Think about and look at your author review criteria. What sorts of things are you suggesting? Providing guidelines on how to give constructive comments instead of disparaging comments about grammar or language use. And I don't have experience in the policy sphere outside of academia, but I'm pretty excited by the sorts of things that Ranya's paper suggested, and I would be curious to see what we can do at a more state or federal level. So I encourage you, leverage the power that you have, and let's all try to make some change of some sort.
Thank you so much. And before I move on to Gabriel, I do want to share this recent publication from Dr. Tarvin's lab that will be shared with you in the chat as well, with the direct link, about overcoming language barriers in academia, machine translation tools, and a vision for a multilingual future. So I hope y'all can access that and enjoy some of our discussion. I know an hour and 15 minutes is not a lot of time to really dig into this, but final words from Gabriel.
This is Gabriel speaking. I have to echo what my colleagues here in the panel have mentioned, Rania, and of course, Dr. Tarvin, having an open mind, having an open heart, and being authentic. Authentic in those conversations, authentic in your communication. STEM has a lot of factors that can really encourage people to enjoy math, to like math, to get into science. A lot of individuals think math is complicated, but it really isn't. There are ways to generate that interest, to get people really focused on it, and that will lead to, of course, future successes by having people just incorporate STEM into their general life. And I will finish up my comment with having an open mind, having an open heart, and being authentic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today and for the work that you continue to do. I would like to not only ask our audience, but feel free to connect with folks. Our team behind the scenes will be dropping the links for the Twitter handles, as well as Rebecca's webpage as well, if you want to see some of their work live. And on also a shout out to Cristiano and Paula. Cristiano in particular is part of the American Co-Deaf Enterprise. So that's the email there if you would like to capture that. And ways that you can get involved within the National Science Policy Network. So here's our little advertisement plug. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee brings these sorts of learning webinar spaces to you. You can also catch us at our public committee meetings. The next one coming up will not be this Wednesday, but next Wednesday, October 19th. You can email DEI@SciPolNetwork.org to directly connect with the chair, Thomas Burnett, and get involved there. Many of the folks who are behind the scenes, so I'll give a shout out to both Jasmine Yu and Aditi Sharma Singh, who are helping me do all of the technical work behind the scenes, and as well, again, Marcy Cockrell, who can't be here today. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, this is not the only webinar in making science accessible for all. So if you'd like to join us, our next one is actually in a couple of weeks, Friday, October 28th, 2:30 Eastern. We are going to be talking about disability, inclusion, and advocacy. And I'm very excited to bring Dr. Jennifer Sarrett, Alyssa Paparella, aka @Disabled in STEM on Twitter, and Dr. Anita Marshall to talk about that lens from the disabled community. So with that, I believe all the links are shared. If you could take a moment to fill out our evaluation form that will pop up afterwards. We will also be putting all of our comments and links to things in an end of webinar event email. So be on the lookout for that. I will also say, because we are recording, once we clean up the machine translated captions, we will have this webinar accessible for everyone publicly on our YouTube channel. And so with that, I will say there are many ways to get connected with the Science Policy Network, NSPN, via social media, as well as getting involved in the work that we do. So feel free to check out the community there. And thank you all for a wonderful, a little bit over an hour of great conversation and time about language access in STEM.